Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Jay Valgora.
I'm here to talk about designing for equity and the transformation of the Astoria Waterfront. Waterfronts have always fascinated me. I grew up in Buffalo, and the grain elevators of Buffalo were actually the inspiration that made me want to become an architect and a planner. My dad worked in the steel mills of Buffalo, and I also saw what magnificent structures these were, how they could transform waterfronts, but I also saw how they could degrade the environment, and I experienced firsthand what happened when they decayed and went down when I was in architecture school. I was actually afraid my father would lose his job, and I had to get scholarships and things in order to finish it. And I saw what happened to those structures afterwards, and I went back as a student and sketched them and drew them. I was obsessed with them. And I became really interested in what would happen with the transformation of the American waterfront. Now, I lived in a lot of cities, and I ended up going to Boston, London, San Francisco, Toronto. They were all great waterfront cities, but I ended up ultimately in New York, which I think is the greatest waterfront city of all. And I started a firm here called STUDIO V Architecture, and I get to work with wonderful people there. And a big part of our work has become the transformation of the Astoria Waterfront, including this giant peninsula you can see right here, which is the Halletts Peninsula. A lot of New Yorkers don't even know it, even though it's right in the heart of the waterfront. So if we really want to start with the East River and the Astoria Waterfront and what's happening, I think we have to go back to the original recreation of Mannahatta that was done, and to start with, how did this land actually evolve, and what happened here? So originally, this was an area of forest. This was the country outside of New York as New York developed, and it had soft edges. It had trees through the 18th and the 19th century. It developed into a small village, a village that was actually born from the waterfront, from a steamship landing that actually created a beautiful little main street right from the ferry. And this was Old Astoria Village, which began on the waterfront, and it developed into a wonderful little urban landscape of 5-, 6-story buildings, shops, a vibrant main street. Now, over time, that changed, and that peninsula to the left is this dark part in the photograph, but with the bridges and with the advent of the subway, the center of Astoria moved progressively further and further to the east. It changed further over time, where this original place, which was a vibrant waterfront village, became instead an industrial area, like where I grew up in Buffalo, with old decayed industrial buildings. And then finally, under the Robert Moses administration, it kind of became a place where we decided to warehouse people that were less fortunate. And in these isolated neighborhoods, the New York City Housing Authority campus of Astoria Houses was built in the 1950s. That's part of our story, too. So today, this is one of the poorest areas in the city. You can see the black part in the middle. More than 50% of children growing up in this neighborhood grow up in poverty, even today, with the affluence of New York. So how do we build equitable communities, and how is the waterfront a vehicle for that transformation? We need streets, infrastructure, we need all kinds of housing, we need parks and playgrounds. So we're going to talk about that a little today, because the site today is isolated, cut off. There's almost no streets going into it, which is shocking. Many of the streets were removed when the NYCHA campus was built, and what was originally a vibrant neighborhood filled with streets and gardens and houses and buildings, with the advent of tower and the park planning, it removed almost all of those streets to the point where it became almost completely isolated, disconnected, where all of the streets kind of wrapped around the peninsula. A single street, 27th Avenue, would go in. It was the only way to get in. And so our first move is to reconnect these streets. As simple as that, reconnect the public realm. And as a larger sense, I like to think of, how did Brooklyn evolve with the plans of Olmsted, the great boulevards? What if we could create a series of great boulevards that actually connected this area that today very few people think about, and would become the center of a whole new waterfront community with these grand boulevards, just as Olmsted made these beautiful boulevards through empty areas in Brooklyn when he first did Ocean Parkway? Could we, on 4th Street in Astoria, create new streets, boulevards that lead you to the waterfront, like this new street we're designing, that actually leads right to the center of the view of the Hell's Gate Bridge on 4th Street? So lack of housing diversity is really important, and New York is made up of very, very diverse neighborhoods. Today, this is all industrial and just low-income housing. And so what if we could create a whole complex here? We're doing 5 separate projects with 4 independent developers, as well as a city agency, the New York City Housing Authority, to actually create all kinds of housing. We need market rate housing, and we need affordable housing. We need to mix them together in creative ways. We need to intermingle them. So originally, when the Astoria Houses development was done in the 1950s, I love this photo. I thought it was a rendering that shows these beautiful open green spaces. This is what it was like when it was done. But today, Large areas are cut off. There's fences. There's parking lots within the middle of them. And so we actually analyzed this, and out of the 27 acres, only 15% of it was accessible to the public. All the shaded areas, people can't go into them. They're fenced off. So we said, what if we could actually create new buildings in between here, schools, community facilities, affordable housing, and we can actually add buildings, but increase the amount of usable public space within the campus. Now, this is a controversial policy, and many politicians have come out and said, well, do we want to take these NYCHA campuses? Should we be infilling them? But I say yes. My own wife grew up in one of these. We have family that grew up in it, and it was actually transformative for them, but I think it's essential that we use these to transform them. And so we're looking at putting all of these different building complexes and changing it from this to that with schools, affordable housing, and new buildings, as well as market. In the press, somehow we got this project already approved, and it's already happening. And I think it's a showcase project for what will happen in the future with NYCHA campuses. Now, there's still a lack of schools. So this is one of the things we had to address. So through our plans, we're actually building 3 new schools, some on private developers' land, which they're contributing for free, and some of it on the NYCHA campus, so that we can create new opportunities and new school buildings for the children that live in this community. There's other areas. Infrastructure is a big deal in Queens. They have more brownouts. They have more electricity problems than most of the places. And here, we're actually doing with the first project at Halletts Point with the Durst organization, a cogeneration plant that not only will generate power, but put it back into the grid. Sewers are also a problem, where today, some of the sewage is actually ejected into the peninsula, into the water. And they're actually building also at our first project, Halletts Point, a sewage treatment plant, so that again, it won't actually draw from the neighborhood. It will actually help alleviate the problem. Transportation, the administration has really stepped up with the 5-borough water taxi system, and that's going to reconnect this neighborhood that originally began at the water. And today, where there's environmental degradation or resiliency problems, we're going to be building the buildings up above the floodplain. We're going to be creating new waterfront gardens with soft edges that actually absorb the water. And we're creating these innovative rain gardens with Ken Smith that actually bring the stormwater and they actually capture it and bring it into these green streets and create great public streets too. We're going to take the lack of retail and we're going to build new retail streets, including a new cooperative supermarket. And we're going to create new public parks with restaurants and cafes along the edges. The last part is playgrounds and parks. We're going to be building new playgrounds, new parks for the people in this community, connecting 2.5 miles of waterfront, and creating spaces like this to really create a transformative vision for what Astoria could be. So I come back to the original slide about Central Park and the Edge and the East River. And if Central Park was originally the first vehicle for equity, where Olmsted planned a place where all the classes could come together, if the West Side was developed to bring us into the 20th century, the advent of the car, Olmsted's Park for Riverside Park, the Hudson River parks, that really transformed New York in the 20th century. But the 21st century belongs to the East River. The East River will become a new center for sustainable communities, for affordable housing, schools, institutions, and ultimately jobs. And I believe the transformation of the waterfront will be essential to creating a more equitable New York. Thank you.